January 12, 1961. The Stardust Casino showroom buzzed with cigarette smoke and champagne laughter as Ruby Castellano adjusted her 30-pound feathered headdress backstage, never imagining that a misplaced lipstick case would unravel one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations on American soil. She believed her biggest concern that night was nailing the lift in the second act of Lido de Paris. Within 48 hours, federal agents would be sitting in her dressing room, and a network of deep-cover operatives who had been stealing atomic secrets for nearly a decade would begin to crumble. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Ruby had arrived in Las Vegas 3 years earlier with a single suitcase and a dance scholarship rejection letter from Juilliard tucked in her purse. She was 21 years old, fresh from Brooklyn, with legs that could hold a perfect arabesque for 2 minutes straight, and a smile that photographed like liquid gold under stage lights. The Stardust hired her within a week. By 1959, she was one of 32 showgirls in the most elaborate production show on the Strip, performing 3 shows nightly, 6 days a week, for a salary that seemed impossible back in New York. The dressing room she shared with 5 other girls smelled perpetually of hairspray, cold cream, and the particular metallic tang of costume sequins that had been sweated in too many times. Each showgirl had a station with a mirror ringed in bright bulbs, a chair that wobbled, and a makeup kit that had traveled from theater to theater, city to city, collecting the residue of 1,000 performances. Ruby kept her space meticulously organized. Every tube of lipstick stood at attention, every false eyelash had its designated case, every pair of fishnet stockings rolled precisely and stored in the 3rd drawer from the top. On this particular January night, the desert air outside was cold enough to see your breath. But inside the Stardust showroom, it was always summer. The hydraulic lifts that moved props and performers 30 feet below or 10 feet above the stage hummed with mechanical precision. Ruby could feel the vibration through the floor as she painted her lips the specific shade of red that looked right under the amber stage lights. Crimson Dawn, the tube said. She had 16 identical tubes in her kit. The show that night went perfectly. Ruby and the other showgirls glided through the opening number wearing costumes that weighed as much as small children, all feathers and rhinestones, and precisely engineered structural boning. They smiled with their teeth showing, turned in perfect unison, never let the audience see the pain in their feet or the sweat running down their backs under the hot lights. The headliner that night was a comedian from New York who told jokes Ruby had heard 100 times, but she laughed on cue, hit her marks, and made it look effortless. After the second show, Ruby had 90 minutes before the 3rd and final performance of the night. She changed out of her costume, hung it carefully on the designated rack where the wardrobe mistress would find it for steam pressing, and slipped into her street clothes. Most of the girls used the break to eat or smoke or gossip, but Ruby had a different routine. She walked to the casino floor, bought a cup of coffee from the restaurant, and sat at the bar near the roulette tables, watching the players and the dealers and the whole beautiful machinery of chance and money that kept Las Vegas running 24 hours a day. She liked to watch people. It was a dancer's habit, studying how bodies moved, how faces changed when they won or lost, how men held their shoulders differently when they were lying. She had been doing this for 3 years, long enough that some of the regular players recognized her and would wave or buy her a drink. Long enough that she knew the patterns of the casino better than most people who worked there. That night, a man sat down 3 stools away from her at the bar. He was not remarkable, middle-aged, average height, wearing a suit that was nice enough but not expensive. Thinning hair combed straight back. Reading glasses that he took on and off as he reviewed what looked like engineering documents spread across the bar in front of him. Ruby noticed him because he ordered coffee instead of liquor, which was unusual for this hour. She noticed him because his shoes were wrong. They were government-issued dress shoes, the kind military men wore, not the Italian leather you saw on businessmen staying at the Stardust. She noticed him because he kept looking at a man across the casino floor, quick glances that lasted no more than 2 seconds each, precise as a metronome. Ruby followed his gaze. The other man was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and a face that suggested Eastern European ancestry. He was playing blackjack at a table with moderate stakes, not winning or losing dramatically, just playing steadily while drinking what looked like Scotch neat. Nothing unusual, except that every time the man in the government shoes glanced over, the silver-haired man would touch his ear or adjust his watch, or move his drink precisely 2 inches to the left. Ruby had grown up in Brooklyn during the war. Her father had worked in the shipyards and came home every night with stories about how they had to watch for saboteurs, how everyone was on alert, how you never knew who might be passing secrets to the enemy. She had absorbed a particular kind of vigilance from those years, a habit of noticing patterns that did not quite fit. She told herself she was being paranoid. Las Vegas was full of odd characters, people with secrets, people watching other people. That was the nature of the city. She finished her coffee and went back to the dressing room. The final show of the night started at 12:30 in the morning and ended at 1:45. Ruby was exhausted by the time she took off her costume, wiped away the makeup, and changed into the skirt and blouse she had worn to the casino earlier. She was gathering her things when she realized her lipstick case was missing. Not just any lipstick case, but the small gold compact her mother had given her before she left New York. It was the one item in her makeup kit that had real sentimental value, and now it was gone. She searched her station thoroughly, then checked the floor around her chair, then asked the other girls if they had seen it. Nobody had. One of them suggested she check the casino bar where she had been sitting during the break. Ruby was tired enough that she almost did not bother, but the compact was important enough that she retraced her steps. The casino was quieter at 2 in the morning, but still active. Serious gamblers played at this hour, the ones who had lost track of time or were chasing losses, or simply had nowhere else to be. Ruby walked to the bar where she had sat earlier and found her compact on the floor beneath the stool, wedged against the brass footrest where it must have fallen from her purse. She bent down to retrieve it, and as she did, she saw something that made her freeze. Tucked into the underside of the bar, held in place with a piece of chewing gum, was a small manila envelope. Ruby was not a spy. She was not trained in espionage or counterintelligence, but she had seen enough movies and read enough newspaper stories about the Red Scare to recognize that this was not normal. People did not hide envelopes under bars with chewing gum unless they had something to hide. She looked around. The man in the government shoes was gone. The silver-haired man was gone. The bartender was at the far end of the bar, mixing drinks for a couple in evening wear. Ruby made a decision that would change everything. She reached up, peeled the envelope free, and slipped it into her purse. Her hands were shaking as she walked out of the casino and across the parking lot to her car, a 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air that she had bought used from another showgirl who was moving back to California. She sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked and opened the envelope. Inside were 3 items, a typed list of numbers that meant nothing to her, a photograph of what looked like technical blueprints for some kind of machinery, and a handwritten note that said meeting confirmed 0300 hours corner of Las Vegas Boulevard and Sahara Avenue Standard Protocol. Ruby sat in her car for a long time, staring at the items spread across her lap. She thought about putting them back. She thought about throwing them away. She thought about minding her own business and going home to her apartment and forgetting this had ever happened. But she kept seeing her father's face, hearing his stories about the shipyard saboteurs, remembering the newspapers she had read about Julius and Ethel Rosenberg going to the electric chair for passing secrets to the Soviets. She started her car and drove to the Las Vegas Police Department headquarters on Stewart Avenue. The desk sergeant looked at her like she was crazy when she tried to explain what she had found. He was a heavy-set man with a mustache and a tired expression that suggested he had seen every variety of strange behavior Las Vegas had to offer. He asked her if she had been drinking. She said no. He asked her if she was sure she had not just found someone's lost paperwork. She said she was sure. He sighed and told her to wait. 30 minutes later, a man in a dark suit came out to meet her. He introduced himself as Special Agent Donald Morrison from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He asked Ruby to tell him everything, from the beginning, and do not leave out any details. She told him about the 2 men at the bar, about the pattern of glances and signals, about finding the envelope. She showed him the contents. He looked at them for a long time without speaking, his face giving away nothing. Then he asked her to describe the men as precisely as possible. Height, weight, hair color, distinguishing features, clothing, shoes, watches, rings, everything she could remember. Ruby had trained as a dancer since she was 6 years old. She had learned to observe, to remember choreography and spacing and timing down to the finest detail. She described both men with a precision that made Morrison sit up straighter in his chair. He asked if she would be willing to work with a sketch artist. She said yes. He asked if she would be willing to testify if it came to that. She said yes. He asked if anyone else knew she had found the envelope. She said no. Then Morrison told her something that made her stomach drop. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been tracking a suspected Soviet spy network in Nevada for almost 2 years. They believed the network was connected to classified work being done at the Nevada test site, where the United States was conducting nuclear weapons tests in the desert 90 miles northwest of Las Vegas. They had identified several suspects, but had not been able to catch them in the act of passing information. What Ruby had found might be the break they needed. Morrison explained that the envelope was a dead drop, a method spies used to pass information without meeting directly. One person would leave material in a predetermined location, and another person would retrieve it later. The fact that Ruby had accidentally intercepted this particular dead drop meant the network did not know it had been compromised. If she was willing to help, the Federal Bureau of Investigation could use this advantage to identify and arrest the entire ring. Ruby asked what he needed her to do. Morrison said the meeting mentioned in the note was scheduled for 3 in the morning, which was less than 40 minutes away. The Federal Bureau of Investigation could place the envelope back under the bar and conduct surveillance to see who retrieved it and where they went afterward. But they needed Ruby to put it back herself, because the bartender and regular casino employees would recognize a federal agent. She would walk in, order another coffee, sit at the same spot, and casually replace the envelope while pretending to adjust her shoe or pick up something she had dropped. Then she would leave, and federal agents would take over from there. Ruby's hands started shaking again. This was not what she had signed up for when she moved to Las Vegas to be a showgirl. She danced for a living. She wore feathers and smiled under stage lights and went home to her small apartment where she practiced her steps and read magazines and lived a perfectly normal life. But she kept thinking about her father and the shipyard saboteurs. She kept thinking about the Rosenberg trial and the newspaper headlines about atomic spies and the photographs of mushroom clouds over the Nevada desert. She kept thinking that if she walked away now, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have happened if she had been brave enough to help. She told Morrison she would do it. 20 minutes later, Ruby walked back into the Stardust Casino with 4 federal agents, scattered invisibly throughout the floor pretending to be gamblers and tourists. She sat at the same bar stool, ordered coffee from the same bartender, who looked mildly surprised to see her back so soon. She drank half the cup slowly, willing her hands to stay steady. Then she dropped her purse on the floor deliberately, bent down to pick it up, and in the motion of reaching for her scattered belongings, she pressed the manila envelope back into place under the bar with a fresh piece of gum that Morrison had given her. She finished her coffee, left a generous tip, and walked out of the casino without looking back. Morrison had told her to go home and wait for contact. He said someone would call her the next day to let her know what happened. He said she should not tell anyone about this. Not her roommates, not her friends, not the other showgirls. He said she had done a very brave thing. Ruby drove home and did not sleep at all that night. She lay in bed watching the ceiling fan turn slowly and wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The phone rang at 10 the next morning. Morrison's voice was quiet but urgent. He said they had arrested 3 people overnight. The silver-haired man from the casino had retrieved the envelope at 3:14 in the morning. Agents had followed him to a house in Henderson, a small city adjacent to Las Vegas. Inside the house, they found 2 other individuals and a cache of classified documents related to nuclear weapons testing procedures, security protocols at the Nevada test site, and technical specifications for radiation detection equipment. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was now conducting a broader investigation to identify the full extent of the network. Morrison said Ruby would need to come to the Las Vegas field office to make a formal statement and work with the sketch artist. He said her name would be kept confidential for as long as possible, but eventually she might be called to testify in court. He said she should prepare herself for the possibility that her role in this case would become public knowledge. Ruby hung up the phone and sat on her couch for a long time, trying to process what she had just learned. She had helped catch Soviet spies, actual Soviet spies, operating in Las Vegas, stealing secrets about nuclear weapons. It seemed impossible, like something from a movie rather than her real life. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation expanded rapidly. The Federal Bureau of Investigation identified 7 more individuals connected to the spy ring, including 2 civilian workers at the Nevada test site, an Air Force sergeant stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, just northeast of Las Vegas, a physics professor at the University of Nevada, and 3 people who ran what appeared to be legitimate businesses in Las Vegas, but were actually serving as couriers and handlers for the network. The ring had been operational for at least 8 years, possibly longer. They had stolen an enormous amount of classified information about American nuclear testing procedures, security weaknesses, and technical capabilities. The case became one of the most significant counterintelligence operations of the early 1960s. The arrests were announced in a press conference in Washington, and within hours, reporters were swarming Las Vegas trying to figure out how the Federal Bureau of Investigation had cracked the case. Morrison kept Ruby's name out of the initial reports, but it was inevitable that the story would eventually leak. It happened on February 6, 1961. A reporter from the Las Vegas Sun newspaper somehow learned that a Stardust showgirl had been involved in breaking the case. The story ran on the front page with the headline, "Showgirl's Sharp Eyes Crack Atom Spy Ring." Ruby's name was prominently featured. Her photograph from a Stardust publicity shot appeared above the fold. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Reporters camped outside her apartment. The Stardust management did not know whether to be thrilled by the publicity or worried about the implications. The other showgirls treated her like a celebrity and a curiosity in equal measure. Letters arrived from all over the country, some praising her patriotism, some accusing her of being an attention seeker, some proposing marriage from men she had never met. Ruby tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. She continued performing in the Lido de Paris show, though now she noticed people in the audience pointing her out to their companions, whispering behind their programs. She continued living in her small apartment, though she had to navigate through reporters every time she came or went. She continued going to the grocery store and the drugstore and the laundromat, though strangers now stopped her on the street to shake her hand or ask for her autograph. The trial began in April 1961. All 10 defendants were charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. The prosecution presented evidence that included the documents Ruby had found, additional materials seized from the Henderson house and other locations, testimony from Federal Bureau of Investigation agents, and forensic analysis linking the defendants to classified information that should not have been in their possession. Ruby testified on the 3rd day of the trial. She wore a simple navy blue dress and no makeup except lipstick, trying to look as unlike a showgirl as possible. The prosecutor asked her to describe exactly what she had seen at the Stardust bar on January 12th, and she told the story clearly and precisely. The defense attorneys tried to suggest she had been mistaken, that she had misinterpreted innocent behavior, that she was seeking attention or had been coached by federal agents. But Ruby's testimony was too detailed and too consistent to discredit. She had noticed things that only someone trained to observe bodies and movements would have caught. The way the man in government shoes had glanced at the silver-haired man with metronomic precision. The specific position of the envelope under the bar. The wrong kind of shoes. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They found all 10 defendants guilty. The sentences ranged from 15 to 30 years in federal prison. The judge, in his closing remarks, called the case a stark reminder that the Cold War was not fought only on distant battlefields, but also in the everyday spaces of American life, even in the glittering casinos of Las Vegas. For Ruby, the aftermath of the trial was complicated. She became famous in a way she had never anticipated or wanted. The Stardust gave her a raise and promoted her to lead showgirl in several numbers, capitalizing on her newfound notoriety. She was invited to speak at civic organizations and women's clubs about vigilance and patriotism. Hollywood producers contacted her agent inquiring about film rights to her story, but the attention was exhausting. Ruby had moved to Las Vegas to dance, not to be a public figure. She missed the anonymity she had once taken for granted, the ability to sit at a casino bar and watch people without being watched herself. She missed being known simply as a good dancer, rather than as the showgirl who caught the spies. She stayed at the Stardust for another 2 years, fulfilling her contract and banking her salary. In 1963, she left Las Vegas and moved to San Francisco, where she opened a small dance studio teaching ballet to children. She married a teacher named Robert Chen in 1965 and had 2 daughters. She almost never talked about the spy case, preferring to let that chapter of her life recede into the past. The Federal Bureau of Investigation later revealed that the spy ring Ruby had helped expose was one of several Soviet intelligence networks operating in the western United States during the late 1950s and early 1960s. The network she stumbled upon had been sending classified information about nuclear testing to Moscow for years, potentially compromising American nuclear capabilities during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. The information they stole included details about bomb designs, radiation measurements, security procedures at testing sites, and vulnerabilities in detection systems. If the ring had continued operating undetected, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Morrison, the Federal Bureau of Investigation agent who had worked with Ruby, said in a later interview that her observation skills had been extraordinary. Most people would have noticed nothing unusual about the 2 men at the bar. They would have retrieved their lost lipstick case and gone home. But Ruby had been trained since childhood to notice bodies, movements, patterns, details that other people missed. That training, developed in dance studios and practiced on stages throughout her career, had translated into a form of surveillance awareness that broke open one of the most significant espionage cases of the Cold War era. The case also highlighted the unusual role Las Vegas played during the Cold War. The city was simultaneously a playground for tourists and celebrities and a strategic location for some of the most sensitive military and nuclear activities in the United States. The Nevada test site was just 90 miles away, close enough that Las Vegas residents could sometimes see the flash of nuclear explosions on the horizon in the pre-dawn hours. Nellis Air Force Base trained pilots and tested weapons systems. The Atomic Energy Commission maintained facilities throughout the region. All of this activity created opportunities for espionage, and Las Vegas's transient population and culture of discretion made it an ideal environment for covert operations. Soviet intelligence had recognized this vulnerability and exploited it systematically. The ring that Ruby helped expose was sophisticated in its structure, using a compartmented cell system where individual members knew only a few other operatives, limiting damage if part of the network was compromised. They communicated through dead drops, coded messages hidden in plain sight, and carefully choreographed meetings that appeared innocuous to casual observers. They recruited American citizens who had access to classified information and were vulnerable to ideological persuasion or financial inducement. They operated for years without detection, gradually building a comprehensive picture of American nuclear capabilities. The fact that the entire operation was unraveled by a showgirl who happened to notice wrong shoes and a pattern of glances was both ironic and instructive. It demonstrated that sophisticated intelligence operations could be undone by simple human observation. It showed that vigilance did not require specialized training or official authority, just attention to detail and the courage to act on suspicion. It proved that ordinary Americans living ordinary lives could play crucial roles in protecting national security. Ruby never thought of herself as a hero. In interviews years later, after her story had become a footnote in Cold War history, she downplayed her role. She said she had just been in the right place at the right time, or perhaps the wrong place depending on how you looked at it. She said any other showgirl might have done the same thing if they had seen what she saw. She said the real heroes were the Federal Bureau of Investigation agents who had conducted the actual investigation and built the case that sent 10 spies to prison. But Morrison disagreed. In his memoir published in 1987, he devoted an entire chapter to the Stardust case. He wrote that Ruby Castellano had displayed a combination of observational acuity, civic responsibility, and personal courage that was rare in any context. She had noticed details that trained agents had missed. She had made the decision to report what she found, rather than ignore it. She had agreed to help with a dangerous operation despite having no obligation to do so. She had testified in court, knowing it would change her life irreversibly. She had acted not because it was her job, but because it was the right thing to do. The spy ring she helped dismantle had been part of a broader Soviet intelligence effort to penetrate American nuclear programs during the Cold War. From the Manhattan Project during World War II through the 1960s, Soviet intelligence agencies had devoted enormous resources to stealing American atomic secrets. Networks of spies, some ideologically motivated and some recruited through blackmail or payment, had infiltrated government agencies, research laboratories, military bases, and private contractors involved in nuclear work. They had stolen bomb designs, manufacturing processes, testing data, and strategic plans. They had given the Soviet Union access to information that significantly accelerated their nuclear program and complicated American strategic calculations during the most dangerous phase of the Cold War. The Rosenberg case in the early 1950s had exposed one major atomic spy ring. The Klaus Fuchs case had revealed another. The Harry Gold network had shown how extensively Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project itself. And now, the Stardust case demonstrated that even a decade after these high-profile arrests, Soviet espionage remained active and sophisticated, adapting to new targets and new methods. The 10 individuals arrested in the Stardust case represented a cross-section of how Soviet intelligence recruited assets in the United States. 2 were first-generation immigrants from Eastern Europe, with family connections that made them vulnerable to Soviet pressure. 3 were American citizens who had been recruited during college through communist study groups and then directed to pursue careers that would give them access to classified information. 1 was a military officer who had gambling debts and was blackmailed into cooperation. 1 was a scientist who genuinely believed that nuclear secrets should be shared to prevent one nation from having a monopoly on such destructive power. 3 were professional intelligence officers operating under deep cover as businessmen in Las Vegas. The variety of motivations and backgrounds illustrated the complexity of Cold War espionage. These were not all hardened ideologues or career criminals. Some were ordinary people who had made terrible choices, often for reasons that seemed reasonable to them at the time. Some had been coerced, some had been deceived about the true nature of what they were doing. Some had convinced themselves they were serving a higher purpose, but regardless of motivation, the result was the same. They had stolen classified information about nuclear weapons from the United States and provided it to the Soviet Union during a period of intense strategic competition. They had compromised American security and potentially endangered millions of lives. And their operation had been stopped finally because a showgirl noticed wrong shoes and had the courage to do something about it. Ruby lived quietly in San Francisco for the rest of her life. She ran her dance studio for 30 years, teaching thousands of children the same discipline and attention to detail that had defined her own training. She was active in her community, serving on school boards and neighborhood associations. She volunteered at local hospitals and raised money for arts education programs. She was known in her neighborhood as a gracious private woman who had once been a dancer in Las Vegas and preferred not to discuss her brief moment of national attention. She died in 2012 at the age of 73. Her obituary in the San Francisco Chronicle mentioned the spy case in the 3rd paragraph after noting her work as a dance instructor and her family. The Las Vegas Sun ran a longer piece, remembering her role in what they called one of the most dramatic moments in the city's Cold War history. The Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in Las Vegas sent flowers to her funeral and a letter to her family expressing gratitude for her service to the nation. The Stardust Casino, where it all began, closed in 2006 and was demolished the following year to make room for a new resort that was never built. The site remains an empty lot, one of the few gaps on the heavily developed Las Vegas Strip. But photographs of the old Stardust, with its iconic sign and massive showroom, still circulate as nostalgic reminders of the city's golden age in the 1950s and 60s, when showgirls wore 30-pound headdresses and Soviet spies hid envelopes under bars with chewing gum, and a dancer from Brooklyn changed the course of Cold War history by noticing that someone was wearing the wrong shoes. The case remains a teaching example in Federal Bureau of Investigation training programs about the importance of human intelligence and the value of civilian cooperation in counterintelligence operations. It is cited in academic studies about Cold War espionage as an illustration of how Soviet intelligence adapted to American geography and culture. It appears in documentaries about Las Vegas history as an unexpected intersection of entertainment and national security. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Stardust case is the reminder that history is not made only by presidents and generals and intelligence chiefs. It is made also by ordinary people who happen to be in extraordinary situations and choose to act with courage rather than look away. Ruby Castellano was a showgirl who loved to dance. She was not trained in espionage or counterintelligence. She had no particular interest in politics or international affairs. She just noticed something wrong, trusted her instincts, and did what she believed was right. In that sense, her story is not really about spies or nuclear secrets or Cold War intrigue. It is about the small choices that accumulate into large consequences. It is about the value of paying attention to the world around you. It is about the responsibility that comes with knowledge, even knowledge you never asked for. It is about ordinary courage in ordinary circumstances that turn out to be not so ordinary after all. The Cold War produced many dramatic narratives of espionage and betrayal, of codes broken and secrets stolen, of defections and double agents and elaborate operations spanning continents and decades. But few stories capture the essential randomness and humanity of that conflict as clearly as the story of a showgirl in a feathered headdress who dropped her lipstick case at exactly the right moment to intercept a dead drop that had been operating successfully for years. Few stories illustrate as vividly how the vast machinery of international intelligence operations could be undone by simple observation and civic duty. The men and women who built and maintained the Soviet spy networks in the United States during the Cold War were professionals. They were trained in surveillance and counter-surveillance, in coded communications and dead drops, in compartmentation and operational security. They had resources and support and carefully constructed cover identities, but all of their training and professionalism could not protect them from the possibility that an ordinary citizen might notice something unusual and decide to report it. They could guard against penetration by rival intelligence services, but they could not fully guard against the unpredictability of everyday life in a free society where people were encouraged to be watchful and where individual initiative was valued. This was, ultimately, one of the fundamental asymmetries of the Cold War. The Soviet Union operated as a closed society where surveillance was directed primarily inward, where citizens were discouraged from independent action, where information was tightly controlled. The United States, for all its flaws and contradictions, operated as an open society where vigilance was widely distributed, where ordinary citizens felt empowered to act on their observations, where information flowed more freely, even if imperfectly. That openness created vulnerabilities that Soviet intelligence could exploit, but it also created unpredictable strengths. A showgirl noticing wrong shoes was one small example of those strengths in action. The Stardust spy ring case faded from public consciousness relatively quickly after the trial concluded. Other spy scandals and Cold War crises captured attention. Vietnam escalated. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. New revelations about Soviet espionage networks continued to emerge. The specific details of how a Las Vegas showgirl broke an atomic spy ring became a curious historical footnote, remembered by specialists and Cold War enthusiasts, but largely forgotten by the general public. But for the people directly involved, the case remained vivid and defining. Morrison built much of his subsequent career on the reputation he earned from the Stardust investigation. Several of the convicted spies spent decades in federal prison before being released in quiet exchanges, or simply serving their full sentences and disappearing into obscurity. The victims of their espionage, the American personnel whose security was compromised and whose work was stolen, mostly never knew what had been taken or how close the breach had come to causing genuine catastrophe. And Ruby simply went on with her life, dancing first and then teaching others to dance, raising her family and serving her community, carrying with her the knowledge that she had once stood at an unexpected intersection of history and made a choice that mattered. She did not regret helping to catch the spies, but she also did not romanticize her role. She had done what seemed necessary at the time, and then she had moved on because that was what you did. In this, perhaps, she embodied a particular kind of American character, the pragmatic citizen who steps up when needed and then steps back when the crisis passes, who serves without seeking glory and returns to private life without grand gestures or prolonged celebration. It was a character type that had deep roots in American culture and civic tradition, the volunteer who serves and then goes home, the citizen who takes responsibility without claiming authority. Ruby had been that kind of citizen, and her story was that kind of story. Quieter and less dramatic than the spy novels and Cold War thrillers that filled bookstores and movie screens, but perhaps more true to the actual texture of how history gets made and nations get defended. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.